On July 8, 2018, Richard Duffy tweeted, "There is no meaningful definition of woman. The only people who want it strictly defined seem to want to do so in order to use it to exclude people." Graham Linehan quote tweeted him and said, "Women might like to know that there are a significant number of woke dudes who think this is true. There is no definition of woman. F***ing hell." Avery Edison replied, "Graham, could you define chair for me in a way that includes all things which are chairs and excludes all things which aren't?" Graham responded, "A separate seat for one person, typically with a back and 4 legs," adding, "Happy to help, but try Google next time. The definition of woman is there too." And Mickey D replied with a photo of a horse captioned, "Chair." This is the Museum of Twitter, the show where we talk about the most important tweets in the history of Twitter.com. Because it's Pride Month, I wanted to share what is probably my favorite dunking on a transphobe in the history of Twitter. There are probably more famous ones, specifically the times that J.K. Rowling has been dunked on, but this one I think is just wonderful. And so while it's not maybe as famous as the times that people posterize J.K. Rowling, I think it's worth highlighting. Because Graham Linehan, like J.K. Rowling, is one of those British celebrities who completely lost their mind because of trans issues. Sorry, they lost their mind at the mere existence of trans people just trying to live their lives. Graham is a TV writer who created shows like Father Ted and the IT Crowd, but then sometime in the 2010s, like happened with so many British celebrities, he was online, got in arguments about transgender people, and that's all he talks about now. "My wife left me" is a common internet joke, but he actually has said that his wife left him over this. He's so committed to hating a persecuted minority of people that his wife left him, and he's like, still gonna keep doing it. And so that's why I take so much pleasure watching him get dunked on, like Vince Carter dunking on Frederick Weiss in the Olympics. But I also think that this interaction is a good example of why I think so much of the discussion about trans issues is so silly. And I think the best way to explain this is by talking about the philosopher Diogenes. To be honest, I was not aware of this philosophical argument until I was doing research for this episode, but this is a really good example of it. To make a long story short, the idea is that Plato was asked how to define man, and he said, sort of tongue-in-cheekly, that man was a featherless biped. And so as the story goes, Diogenes brought a plucked chicken to Plato and said, "Behold a man." The point being, among other points, that it's really hard to define something, and that definitions are fungible, and that it's all semantics. And so while this interaction begins with Graham sneering at the idea that you can't define what a woman is, that really is in some ways true, because you can't really define what anything is. At least not in a way that will literally apply to every situation and will be agreed on by everyone. It's why I kind of hate the hypothetical of is a hot dog a sandwich, because it's like, that's not an actual question, that's just a semantic question. Because the answer to any question like that will always be, is it commonly understood as that? And so like, there's no fixed definition of a woman that Graham can point to, because not only is a purely medical definition not sufficient, because there are lots of people with unique or unusual sex organs, but also because woman in this context is not a medical term, so therefore what it is really defined by society generally. And so Richard is correct, there is no meaningful definition of woman in this context, because the context is that people like Graham are trying to make a ruling on whether or not someone is a woman based on a very strict definition. And that's not how these things work. And to illustrate that, Avery Edison, who is a trans comedian herself, throws up a great alley that Mickey D will eventually oop. She asked Graham Linehan to define what a chair is, specifically in a way that includes all things that are chairs and excludes all things that aren't chairs. She couldn't have guessed exactly what he would say, but she knew for sure that he would not be able to do it in a succinct way. Because human language is not absolute, there will always be loopholes. It's why laws are really long, and why I always roll my eyes when people say that laws should be simpler. It's like, no, we want laws to be as specific as possible. And so when Graham responds glibly with a separate seat for one person, typically with a back and 4 legs, and then smugly adds, "Happy to help, but try Google next time," Mickey D is absolutely correct to respond with a photo of a horse. Because yeah, a horse has a seat on it, it has 4 legs and a back, and I'm sure people are watching and saying like, well yeah, obviously that's not what he meant, but that's the whole point. This is why it's useless to act like a definition of a word is the final say on anything. Now when the screenshot goes around, a lot of people will be like, a horse really isn't a seat. But I think that just reinforces the whole point, which is that this is all semantics all the way down. I just find this maddening, not just with transphobes, but honestly with annoying people generally, where they act like there's a combination of words and definitions that will make their point objectively correct. But words and definitions don't hold that power. Because the moment you start arguing about whether or not a horse's back is a seat, that opens up the can of worms of what a seat is, and then that will open up another can of worms over what another term is, and another term, and another term. Semantics cannot be the root of your argument. Now, a thing I did enjoy learning is that there's a subreddit called Diogenes IRL, which features arguments like this one, and in the comments of that, Filler Text 908 said something that I think reinforces this whole point as well. They said, there are also a lot of chairs with 1 to 2 legs, like super common. Office chairs can have like 5 or 6 too. And if typically means it's optional, does that make a beanbag a chair? A swing a chair? The rodeo bowl machine? Don't use typically when defining something for the purpose of creating a binary. I couldn't have said it better myself. And in another thread, BK Stevens jokes, you can fit 2 people on that. What you got there is a couch. Look, if you're still on Twitter like I am, you know it's much more of a cesspool than it used to be. There's a lot more outward transphobia, there's a lot more awful stuff going on. And so I wanted to share this exchange, not just because it's funny, but I think it's also instructive to be like, right, these people are not operating in good faith, and so it's not worth treating them as such. And getting into semantic battles with them is a losing effort, even if you do feel like you're right. The pro-trans argument is right because it's morally right, not because it's semantically right. Like, I think it's semantically right right? But semantics are not objective. See, I use this to inspire you to make transphobes look like idiots this Pride Month. Or you can completely ignore them like I usually do. Like, I would love to be the type of person who dunks on ignorant idiots on Twitter, but honestly, when it comes to Twitter dunking, I might as well be Muggsy Bogues. Follow me for a new tweet every day. If you want to support the show, please go to patreon.com/Museum of Twitter. You can vote on what I cover on Subscriber Sundays, and you get the weekly Museum of Not Twitter.